In today's video, we're going to show you how to fit an air shock to your mountain bike and to get it set up for your body weight. Installing a shock to your bike is really quite easy, as is getting it set up, but there are a few things you need to take into consideration before you get started. Now, in an ideal world, once you fit the shock to your bike, when you get it set up, you're going to need to be at your riding weight. That means in your riding shoes, your helmet, hydration pack, carrying tools, all the stuff that will make you a little bit heavier than perhaps when you're not riding a bike, because that does affect the sag, which we're going to get to later in the video. Now, depending where you bought your shock, it may have the appropriate hardware attached to it. Now, this one doesn't, so I'm going to show you how to install that. But you can get this done at a bike shop, at a suspension tuner, or even at the place where you purchase your actual shock absorber from. Now, bear in mind that if you do this yourself, you will need a few specific tools. But that said, it's always good to have tools in the workshop, especially if you like working on your bike at home. Okay, so you're going to need a bunch of tools for the job, starting with a shock that's appropriate for your bicycle. That means the correct eye-to-eye measurement. They're all different on different bikes. Has to have the correct stroke on there, so it's the amount of travel that the shock can deliver. Has to be compatible with your configuration frame. And also the tune on your shock has to both suit the frame you're buying it for and your body weight and riding preference. Next up, you're going to need the bushings and hardware for your particular shock and frame configuration. Now, for example, this particular shock, which we're not fitting today, actually has a bearing mount pushed into the actual end of the shock here. That's a very particular fitting for certain types of bike. So if you've not got that, you're going to need to get hold of that. And then, of course, there's the bushings that go into the eyelets of the shock. So in here is a DU bushing. That's a very common design, but you can also get low friction bushings like this one and DP bushings, which all do a very similar job, but they're slightly different. Now, if you're to use a DP bushing, these arguably are the hardest wearing, but when they do wear, because of the fact they're metallic and have the bush on the inside, when they do wear, you run the risk of wearing out the hardware. So if you're not on top of things, this might not be the one for you. That said, they work very well. Then you get the low friction offerings. These are great because if your shock has a linkage configuration that enables the shock hardware to actually move quite a lot, the low friction ones are going to give you a really good action, but they do wear a bit quicker and therefore you need to replace them a bit sooner. The good news is, just like the regular DU bushings though, you won't get any wear on your shock hardware. So it's kind of even Stevens really, you just have to consider these things. Now, there's different types of hardware as well. You get ones like these, they're actually top hat style ones that you can push in by hand. You can actually remove these by hand, or you get the ones that actually push in where you'll need a dedicated tool for this. Now, the tool itself is very simple. It's designed literally just to slide all the way through the shock eyelets there using a vise. It's very simple. They cost around 25 quid and you can get some really trick ones. So if this is something you're interested in doing at home and you're likely to do it more than once, it's probably worth your while getting hold of one of these. You can get from any good bike shop or a suspension tuner. You're also going to need Allen keys for your particular configuration. That's likely a 5 and a 6mm, perhaps a 4mm. Having a vise on hand is a good idea if you're going to be installing the bushes into the actual shock. You might want some sort of locking pliers as well if you're going to be removing any hardware from the shock in order to fit the correct stuff to your particular shock. Something like these are good for this job because of the fact that they're non-scoring, like using a set of pliers. They're going to lock in place and enable you to remove that hardware from the shock. Next up, you're going to need some sort of thread lock. Blue is what you want, medium strength. Quite simply to stop those bolts rattling loose. As you know, full well, vibration is something that mountain bikes are susceptible to. You don't want your shock hardware rattling loose. That'll be the end of your ride. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is a shock pump, because you can't get it set up without one. Step one is frame preparation. So as you can see, I already have a shock on this bike, so I'm going to need to remove this one. We're actually going to be using the hardware, like the bolts that run through this, to fit the new shock to the bike. So I'm going to remove those, give them a clean, and make sure all the hardware and everything else around on the frame there is nice and clean. Now, before you remove the shock, it's a really good idea to remove the rear wheel, because this is all additional weight pulling down on the back end. When you remove that shock, depending on your frame configuration, you may well have a linkage that fails scars on the frame that could take some paint off. So by taking the wheel out, you're taking the extra weight out of the equation. And have a look, cycle your suspension through the travel before you let go of it. Just make sure that nothing contacts. If it does, get a rag, stuff it in there, just to make sure you've got no sort of metal to carbon or metal to metal action there that can give you any sort of headaches. Now, one last thing just to mention here is the actual threaded inserts that are part of your frame that the hardware screws into. Sometimes they're removable. In this case, it has a flip chip, so you can change the geometry of the bike with these. So if you're going to remove these to clean them, just take care that they go back in the correct orientation that you want. Another thing to add, this is carbon frame and this is metal hardware, so I'm actually going to use a tiny smidgen of assembly compound in there, just because if there's any movement that can translate as creaking. Just something to take into account. I'm using a carbon safe compound, so it's essentially a carbon safe grease and it's got floating particles in it just to add a tiny bit of traction. You only need the tiniest bit on there. Make sure you don't get any of this in the actual threads, because we're going to want to just put a bit of thread lock in those when we reassemble everything. Now, as you can see, the shock we're going to fit to the bike has no hardware and no bushings installed to it. So I'm actually going to remove the hardware from this coil shock that was on the bike and install it onto this one, just to show you how. Now, there's a style of stuff that you need to remove using the actual dedicated bushing tool, which we're going to show you, but also your bike might have these, which are like top hat style bits of hardware. If that's the case, you can remove these very easily because they're soft and likely they're quite worn. You might be able to do it by hand, or with a set of locking pliers like these without damaging them, straight out, and then it gives you access to the bushing. And the same applies on this end. Again, been pretty lucky with this one, that one's a little bit stiffer, but just take care. You don't want to score anything here, just slide these off without damaging anything. You might get one that's quite stubborn, in which case definitely a soft jaw on a vise is what you need. But this one luckily comes straight out, so good for me to reinstall on the new shock. Next step is to get your bushing removal tool and basically mount it through the actual eyelet. So you'll see there's a step on there. You want that step to rest up against the bushing. Get the tool in the vise and carefully squeeze it together, and you'll see it just pushes the bushing straight out the other side. Super simple, great bit of kit. And now it's time to put the hardware into that new shock. Now, something here just to take into account, depending on the style of shock and style of frame you have, is to make sure you have access to your climb switch, your compression switch, your lockout switch, however you want to refer to it. Now, this will be affected if your shock has a piggyback or not, because the orientation that you can actually put the shock in the frame. On this particular frame, I can have the lever at the top at the front, and I can reach that whilst I'm riding, so that is the optimum position. But on your bike, it might be in a different position. It might be upside down at the rear. It's not always the same, so just double check this before you put the hardware in place. And you should be able to do this by hand. Be a bit stiffer with those fresh bushes going in. These ones are the older ones, so they actually go in, not too bad. And then make sure that you put all of the correct bits and pieces in place. Next part of the puzzle is to install the shock now. So you want to offer the shock up in the correct orientation and make sure it slides into place on both ends of the shock mounts. Then you want to get the bolts and get a tiny bit of blue thread lock and just apply it to the threads and slide the bolts into place. Now note that you're quite likely to have to manipulate the back end of your bike to make them both line up. So I would always start with the rear bolt first and then offer up the front one. It's up to you how you do this, whatever works best for your configuration. Now the shock is in place, we just need to get the back wheel into the bike. Then we're going to take the bike out of the work stand and start getting the sag set up on the bike. So that is your first major point to getting the suspension set up for you. First things first is to get to base settings with your rear shock, and then you can make some fine adjustments to make the bike suit the way you want to ride. Now, the most important thing to do to achieve this is to get the correct sag for both the shock and the bike design you have. Now, sag is the amount of suspension compresses when you sit on the bike. Now, this needs to compress and you need to have sag because you obviously have hollows and holes in the ground that the wheel needs to track with, as well as bumps that it needs to absorb in an upwards motion. So therefore, you have to have the correct amount of sag. Too little sag, your suspension is going to feel very harsh and you probably won't use all that suspension. too much, your bottom bracket is going to be really low, so you're going to strike your feet on the floor all the time, and you're going to use too much of the travel. The bike's going to be quite lethargic and not handle as the design is intended. Now on this particular bike, we're looking for 30% of the available travel as sag. Now this particular shock has a handy measurement system on here, and it tells me what 20, 30 and 40% is. But it also tells me that it's got 60 millimeters of stroke on here. So if you divide that by 100 and you times that by 30, you'll get 18, which is 18 millimeters of sag. So if your bike doesn't have the measurements already on the shaft there, all you need to know is the amount of stroke that it has and the amount of sag you want to work it out. It's pretty simple. Now before you go changing the air pressure and the settings on your shock, you need to get to a good base setting first. Now to do this, you want to unwind any damping that's on the shock, so counterclockwise on both the compression and the rebound, to make sure these don't have any effect on what the air pressure is doing on the shock. And then you want to inflate your shock to 100 psi, and you need to compress it 4 or 5 times about halfway through the travel. Now on all modern air shocks, you have both a positive and a negative air chamber. The reason you need to do this process is to charge that negative chamber, and this is achieved by one single valve. Now approximately halfway through that travel, you have a little dimple on the inside of the shock, and enables the air to transfer from the positive into the negative to balance out. So that's what this achieves before you then make the adjustment for your body weight. Okay, so I've got 200 pounds in the shock to correlate to my body weight. Now what we're aiming for here is to achieve 30% sag when I'm sat in the saddle of the bike. I'm going to do this by sitting next to the workbench, so I can lean on here just to keep myself upright. Lean against the wall, get a buddy to hold your handlebars, anything you can to try and get a realistic approach. Now to actually get this a real good reading, what you need to do is set the O-ring on your bike. This one's got a black O-ring on here, but yours might be red or another colour. Set this up against the main seal there, and then get onto the bike, bounce around a little bit so it lets it settle. Remember that if it's a brand new shock, it won't be as sort of slippery in its action as it will be once it's bedded in. So important to give a little bit of movement there. Then carefully reach down and reset that O-ring so it's touching the seal, and as delicately as you can to not upset that travel, get off the bike, and you'll get some sort of reading as where you are. And then you have to make an adjustment from there, either reducing air to achieve 30% or adding more air in. Let's see where we are, shall we? You might fluke it the first time, but it's fairly unlikely. Right, just gonna make sure it settles. Set the O-ring back and then carefully unweight the bike. Ah, that's just about bang on. I think I'm happy with that. So that's 30% sag right there. So that's the optimum for this shock for this bike. Obviously, I've not got any riding gear on here, so in real world, I'd actually probably need a tiny bit more air in there. That's why it's important at this stage for you guys to actually have your riding pack on, but you get the idea. And that is how you get your sag set up. Now, once you've got your sag set up, you need to start thinking about your damping adjustments on the shock. Now, these are different depending on whatever model of shock you have, but you will typically have a compression adjustment of some kind, which is more than likely a lever, could be 2 or 3 position. This one has 2 position, and will have a damping dial for the rebound. Now, your rebound controls the rate at which the shock extends. The more air you have to have in your shock, the more rebound damping you will need to control the rate at which it extends. It's pretty simple, really. Now, you want to have your shock feeling as fast as possible, that it doesn't make the bike feel out of control, essentially. You don't want the bike to be able to bounce and come unsettled when you land from a jump. And neither do you want to have too much rebound on there that the bike doesn't extend fast enough for the next impact. So I'd actually go on the slower side to start with and back off if need be, but everyone has a slightly different variation on the way they like to set these things up. And then with your compression damping dial, you'll find, I mean, this one has a low speed dial and it also has an actual lockout threshold switch. Now the switch essentially is like a climbing switch just to stop the bike from bobbing around when you're climbing, so you don't need to mess with that. But there's a little dial on the underneath here, a little blue one, and that affects the low speed compression. Now essentially that will help the bike resist bobbing, perhaps if you're pedaling, and sort of keep the bike a little bit higher in the travel, but it also will reduce sensitivity slightly, so it's a little fine line there to experiment with. I'd always go in the middle setting for something like this to experiment with, and then work your way either way to see what works best for you. There you go, that's how you get your sort of your base settings for your rear shock. Now, as I said before, it's really important to get the sag nailed because that really does affect that dynamic ride height of your bike. If you're too low down, everything's going to be wallowy, you're going to hit your feet on the floor, and it's just not going to feel right. And if it's too firm, i.e. if you've got not enough sag, you're not going to be making the most of all that suspension that you've got on your bike. And again, with those settings, with the compression and rebound, it takes a little time to master your settings, but a quick way to get there with the rebound that I've found works for me is to ride off a curb, sat down, obviously do this somewhere safe, maybe like a car park. And what you're looking for is the bike to not want to bounce up too fast. You want it to just kind of compress nicely and sort of just come up slowly. Too slow, you'll know about it. Too fast, you'll know about it. It kind of gives you a good ballpark area to get to, and then you can work on from there. Any questions with sag, compression, rebound, stuff like that when it comes to air shocks, do let us know in the comments underneath, and we'll see you in the next maintenance video. See you later.